The day Neria Halim won the auction was the day the town decided she'd finally gone too far. Even the wind in Karbad's empty industrial yards seemed to judge her, scraping along corrugated roofs and rattling a chain-link gate like a disapproving ant. She stood with the confirmation email glowing on her cracked phone and stared at the hulking carcass that had been delivered on a tilt-bed truck, a rust-sick armored vehicle little taller than her father's old sugarcane tractor and twice as stubborn, its sides scabbed with oxidation, its tracks sagging like a tired serpent. Before her courage could blink, Neria spoke into the silence, as if the machine could hear, "You and me, we're going to move again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you." The driver signed the delivery slip with a distracted flourish and left her in a cloud of diesel breath. Neria waited for the dust to fall away so the shape of her gamble could settle in her eyes. A decommissioned M113, the listing had said, though the whole wore more guesswork than paint. Once, a squad carrier. Now, an embarrassment on tracks. She'd paid less than the price of a new pickup engine and more than she could afford. "Madwoman," muttered the scrap dealer from next door. Rafiq liked to pry copper from refrigerators and stories from other people's mistakes. "You'll bleed money until there's nothing left to rust." Neria smiled without letting him into the room of her resolve. "You've been saying that for years. I'm still here." "Because your father left you walls," he sneered, gesturing at the block-walled workshop her father had built with his own hands, 2 bays, 1 hoist that squealed and a minor key, a bench crowded with wrenches that had outlived 3 currencies. "But walls don't make engines sing." "Engines sing when someone listens long enough," she wanted to tell him. Instead she ran her palm over the hole where sun blistered the last of its olive drab into the color of distant storms. The metal held heat like a fever. Somewhere under all that scale and memory, she felt the old hum of purpose, faint as a heartbeat through a winter coat. She glanced at the sky. The monsoon was late the way grief is late, quiet for weeks and then everything at once. The lowlands had already soaked up too much rumor and not enough rain. When it came, it would come like a verdict. "You're cutting it close, Neria." She rolled her shoulders, the way she did before lifting something impossible. "Close is how you learn," she whispered. "It began with a ritual, doors, locks, breath." Neria dragged the workshop's rolling doors open until the old bearings complained, let the daylight stride in, and set a drip pan under the whole center because lessons had taught her that everything leaks at first. She threaded a lifting strap through 2 hatch rings and coaxed the engine cover open. Corroded bolts whined. The lid accepted daylight for the first time in a decade and exhaled the scent of dead coolant and mouse nests. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, and almost laughed at herself because she'd sworn years ago never to call machines by anything softer than their names. But this one, this lump of steel and memory, felt like a stray animal showing teeth and hope. The power pack looked like a fossilized organ. Hoses had gone brittle. Harnesses were as crisp as old bread. A smear of oil had congealed around a front seal into a topography map of neglect. But the core, the block, was intact, uncracked, waiting. Her mind sorted tasks the way a conductor lays out a score: strip, clean, catalog, purge the old fluids, renew coolant, oil, filters, test the starter with a donor battery, refurbish the fuel system, hunt leaks like a patient hunter. She pulled her hair into a knot and got to work. By noon, her arms were varnished with grime up to the elbow. By mid-afternoon, Rafiq had made 3 passes pretending to look for a misplaced compressor and managed to mutter 6 variations of waste in her hearing. Each time, she ignored him. When the sun softened enough to admit a breeze, Neria rolled a drum of solvent to the doorway and began disentangling the wiring harness with the care of a surgeon threading a nerve. She laid each piece on a canvas drop cloth and tagged it with masking tape in her looping hand: temp sensor AFT, fuel return, alt feed. She photographed each angle with her old phone, backups of backups because memory, she'd learned, makes better promises than it keeps. The engine's bolts were tired. The engine hoist was older. She tightened the hoist screw until the chain went taut and said a small prayer in the language of torque: please hold, I know I'm asking for a little more than you were built to give. The block lifted with a groan that trembled through the floor, and for a moment she thought of her father's shoulders under a sack of cement, the way he'd glance at her to see if she was watching and then glance away, embarrassed to be seen as strong. You see them as they could be, he used to tell her, standing over a carburetor the size of a fist. That's your gift. Most people only see what something is. She guided the engine toward the stand, breath measured as a welder's bead, and bolted it down to a future. When it was secure, she let the chain go slack and the hoist sagged with relief. The quiet after that sounded like possibility. In the evening, the inspector arrived. Not official, Carbad had no officials who worried about projects that didn't pay them to worry, but the inspector everyone answered to anyway. Howa rolled in on a battered bicycle, sorry tied tight for practicality, her notebook balanced on the basket like a judge's book of laws. I heard you bought a tank, Howa said without preamble, kicking the stand and dismounting with the grace of a woman who'd dodged more potholes than most men had opinions. Carrier, Neria corrected, glancing at the hole through the open bay. Old. Empty. Angry. We're in negotiations. Howa's eyes softened despite herself. You named it yet? Not until it earns it. You working against the sky again? Howa asked, chin flicking toward the gray seam that had been thickening all day. Trying to beat the first hard rain, Neria admitted. If the Lowland Causeway floods like last year, the villages will be islands. The new bridge is still drawings and ribbon-cutting promises. This thing can ford waist-deep water without crying about it. Howa's pencil paused. You think it will run? I think it will run like it misses it, Neria said. And in the space after, the truth she didn't say, I need it to. Because last year they'd strapped a feverish child to the back of a motorcycle and waded up the causeway with water trying to drag them into the rice fields. Because a mother's scream travels farther in floodwater than any warning siren. Because engines were the only language Neria spoke with complete faith, and she had to speak now. Howa closed the notebook without writing anything. Rafik says you'll bankrupt yourself, she said. Then, softer, Rafik says a lot. Rafik eats doubt for breakfast, Neria replied. Doubt is cheap, Howa said. Fuel is not. She looked at the harnesses, the labeled tags, the patient order and the chaos. You're careful. I'm allowed one talent, Neria said lightly. You have two, Howa said dryly. Careful and stubborn. She swung back onto the bicycle. Tell me when you need people to push. Thank you. Don't thank me, Howa advised. Finish the thing, then drag me into labor. That's how to make a politician look good. Her laugh trailed behind her like a ribbon as she pedaled away. Neria slept on a canvas cot beside the hole that night, her dreams full of hatches refusing to open and bolts that rounded off into infinity. Rain ticked on the roof toward dawn, not enough to rattle the gutters, just a rehearsal. She woke to the smell of wet dust and a text from an unknown number. Unknown, heard you're playing with army toys. Careful they don't come take it back. She stared at the screen until the letters lost meaning. Then she deleted the message. She'd paid for the whole fare, through legal surplus, with papers so clean they squeaked. But papers meant little when uniforms felt like trying on power. She brewed tea on a portable stove and traced her to-do list with her finger as if she could carve time into more than it was: rebuild water pump, rewire starter relay, flush fuel tank, fabricate a new exhaust clamp, hone the cylinder walls if they begged for it, send an email to the donor who'd promised medical supplies if she could promise logistics. The list calmed her. Lists were boats, you climbed into them and they floated you over worry. By mid-morning, the fuel tank lay on the floor like a whale torn from the sea. Neria swished bolts inside it with solvent to knock loose rust flakes, the clang traveling up her forearms. When she poured out the slurry, it glittered like a jar of old blood. She flushed it again and again until the solvent ran clear, then set the tank in the sun like a patient under a lamp. A scooter buzzed into the yard. A young man in a neat shirt and mirrored shades stepped off with the poise of someone who'd practiced a performance. Madam Halim? Yes. He produced a laminated ID with more holograms than words. Defense Liaison Office. We're conducting a routine sweep of decommissioned equipment to ensure compliance. Neria wiped her hands on a rag and met his reflection in his glasses. It's a legal surplus purchase. I have the release papers and serials. Also, you're far from routine. He smiled like a salesman who'd been told charm was half the job. May I see them? She fetched the folder from the safe her father had bolted under the bench and laid out everything, the auction printouts, the bill of sale, the demilitarization certificate. He tilted his head as if waiting for the documents to confess something. It's for disaster relief, she added, against her own rule of never volunteering beyond the asked. Ambulance conversion. We've had bad floods. Very noble. His gaze drifted toward the holes-open hatches as if the machine might whisper the truth to him. You understand certain features must remain disabled. It's a box on tracks, she said. Its only weapon will be a siren. He nodded as if he'd said that. We will visit again. Please bring donuts, she said before she could stop herself. He blinked. Donuts? For your routine inspection. She kept her face plain. They make it look more official. He left with a confused salute. When the scooter's whine faded, Neria let out a breath she hadn't admitted she was holding. The message had been clear enough, you may be within the lines, but the lines can move. The first start attempt was a liturgy. Battery cables snugged with care. Fuel line primed with a clear bulb so she could see the air bleeding out in silvery strings. Neria checked the oil level 3 times, then 2 more to satisfy the sleepless part of her. The intake she left open, her hand poised to smother it if the engine ran away. The fire extinguisher sat within reach like a stern teacher. Ready, she asked the machine. Ready, she answered herself. She thumbed the starter. The motor grunted, then spun. The engine coughed once, a sound like a grandfather waking. She feathered the throttle, coaxing. It coughed again and then came alive in an uneven canter, shaking the hull with the indignation of a creature dragged back from hibernation. Smoke fanned from the exhaust port in a blue flag that smelled of old oil burning off old stories. The gauges wavered from 0 as if remembering their purpose. Coolant began to circulate with the slow confidence of a river finding its bed. Neria laughed. It burst out of her until she had to lean her forehead against the hull. The sound startled a mynah bird on the fence. The bird scolded her, then reconsidered and sang. She held the throttle steady for 10 minutes, eyes never leaving the oil pressure needle as if she could keep it faithful through a tension. When the idle settled and the engine's notes smoothed from insult to conversation, she closed her eyes for 1 heartbeat. Thank you. Then the smell changed. A sharpness threaded the air, the kind that makes mechanics frown before they know why. She killed the engine. The sudden silence hit like stepping off a treadmill. She sniffed. Electrical. Hot insulation. She dove for the battery cutoff and then the harness she'd rebuilt, hands moving without permission. A small puff of smoke lifted from a junction she'd crimped in what felt like another life. Starter relay, new. Her stomach dropped through the floor. The insulation had nicked under a bracket and had begun to arc. It would have grown into a flame that would have crawled with loyalty along the harness until it found something to consume. Not today, she said between her teeth. Not ever. She cut, stripped, soldered, rewrapped, and rerouted with the kind of focus that makes the world smaller, until the joint lay like a clean scar under new protection. She started the engine again, and this time the smell was purely the old oil mourning its end. Word went around Carbad that the madwoman's war car could purr. Children lined the fence in the evening with their parents pretending not to be behind them. Neria let them sit inside one by one with the engine off, showed them the periscope like a toy kaleidoscope, told them that machines remember kindness. She laid her hand on the hull as if calming a shy animal. Why do you fix old things? A girl asked, chin high like someone who expected answers. Because they deserve another chance, Neria said. Do people deserve another chance? Neria tried to keep the wince from her smile. Sometimes the thing we fix is ourselves. After dark, when the kids had been called home by names pronounced with love and exasperation, she welded the first of the brackets that would hold the stretcher rails inside. Sparks flocked in the air like migrating fireflies. She could already see the layout in her head: bench on the left for medics, fold-down seats opposite for evacuees, oxygen bottle bracket by the rear door, LED strips tucked up out of harm's way. She'd scavenge a compact inverter for the suction pump and build a cabinet from birch plywood because plywood forgives mistakes and birch forgives more. Her phone vibrated. Messages piled up like midnight rain. Hawa, district officer wants to see the thing. Tomorrow, 10. Don't bite him. Unknown, you really think you can just drive that around? You'll see. Rafiq, if it moves, I'll eat my hat. Isla, medic from the clinic 2 towns over, we have 6 new stretchers and 2 portable monitors if you can pick up next week. You're a miracle worker. Neria answered the ones that fed the fire and let the others pass like smoke through a room with the windows open. Morning peeled itself into being like an orange, messy and bright. The district officer arrived 10 minutes late in a white SUV that had known mud only as a rumor. He stepped out smoothing his shirt as if this were a photo. He wasn't a cruel man by the shape of his eyes, he was something more complicated, a man used to being the most important person at a meeting. So, he said, looking at the vehicle as if it might sneeze on him, you are building a tank ambulance. An armored medical carrier, Neria said. Floods don't argue with bureaucracy, sir. Neither do landslides. This will go where soft tires cannot. And the army? He gestured vaguely toward the horizon as if soldiers lived somewhere past the sugarcane. They will not object? They signed the paper that said they don't care. She showed him the pages. He pretended to read them and then nodded as if satisfied by the appearance of diligence. He circled the hole and peeked into the open top hatch. It looks cramped. It's only too small until the first person you love is inside, she said before she could file the sharpness from the edges of her voice. He flinched, then rearranged his face into a benevolent smile. The district appreciates innovation, he said in the tone of an announcer at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Please ensure appropriate permissions are appropriate. Appropriately, she said. He left a card with his number printed twice, once in ink and once in the way men like him expected favors to summon themselves, and the promise of a press photographer if our timelines align. Neria watched the SUV leave the yard and felt the thinness of the ground she stood on. She would need more than correctness. She would need momentum. When the first real storm broke, it did not ask for applause. It came in from the east, low and gray, and pressed its palm on the land. The air flipped like a coin. Heat turned to metallic cool. The light went the color of caution tape. Neria's weather app lit up with warnings that metered their urgency with exclamation marks. She closed the workshop doors to a crack and worked under bulbs that humdrummed against the thunder. The radio, the kind that picks up more gossip than signals, popped. Hawa's voice threaded through the static. Kylper Causeway underwater. Repeat, Kylper Causeway underwater. Clinic's generator failed. We have a child with dengue and a pregnant mother in labor. Neria's chest went tight as if the air had narrowed. She checked the engine with hands that made no mistakes, cool and holding, belts taut, oil as black as promises but within the lines. She checked the bilge pump she'd installed at midnight, the way you do things you don't want to admit you might need. She checked the rear hatch's rubber seal, cracked, then replaced with one she'd cut from tractor tire inner tube and persuaded with adhesive and prayer. The stretcher rails held under a simulated weight of concrete bags because sometimes compassion needs rehearsal. She wrote one word on a strip of tape and stuck it above the driver's periscope, steady. Outside, the storm shrugged its shoulders and the yard turned to brown glaze. Rafiq appeared at the door like an omen carved in damp denim. You can't be serious, he shouted over the rain. You'll drown that thing. It floats, she shouted back. It sinks very slowly, he countered, but there was fear under his sarcasm. Road's already a river. Don't be a martyr. I won't, she said. I'll be a driver. He swore and then did something she would replay later when the night grew long. He dragged a stack of pallets to the edge of the yard and built her a makeshift ramp to the street. "If you break your neck on the threshold, I'll never forgive you," he muttered. "Same," she said, and felt something unclench between them. She climbed into the driver's seat and felt the hull say hello through the soles of her boots. The controls were stubborn because they had not been asked to do anything noble in years. She set her hands on the levers and remembered the training she'd given herself from manuals and the memory of movement that lives between a person's shoulder blades. Engine on. Pressure up. Tracks engaged like a handshake from an old friend who used to be your rival. The carrier rolled forward, hesitated at the threshold like a large animal uncertain of a new enclosure, then climbed the pallet ramp as if embarrassed to have been worried. Rain hammered the roof in applause or warning, she couldn't tell which. She took the street at a crawl, the periscope showing a world smeared into watercolor. The first flooded stretch welcomed her like an old challenge. She lowered the bow with a touch of the tiller and let the water come up over the tracks, felt it slap the hull, felt the physics of drag, felt the way mass decides things people cannot. Steady, she told herself. Steady, the tape told her back. A pickup truck sat half-submerged on the shoulder, driver waving a shirt like a flag. Neria stopped alongside, cracked the side hatch, and shouted through rain that made every word an effort. "Can you climb?" He shook his head and pointed to the cab. A woman. A baby in her arms. Wide eyes with the specific fear of someone calculating the weight of water. Neria killed the engine and climbed onto the hull, rain drilling her scalp. She wrapped a line around the pickup's B-pillar and back to a cleat she'd welded last night as if she'd known this moment would arrive. "On 3, she called, voice raw already. 1, 2, 3. The woman scrambled. The baby cried. The man pushed. The water shoved back with the infinite patience of something that has nothing to prove. Neria braced and pulled until her ribs complained. The woman slid onto the hull and Neria grabbed her under the arms and hauled. The three of them lay there for a heartbeat, breathing like bellows. Then Neria got them inside, wrapped them in the wool blankets she'd stashed for this lie. "Everything is going to be okay." She drove on. The road disappeared. The storm decided to show her all its nouns at once: sheet rain, gusts, the whistle of flood through culverts, the sound of trees reconsidering their life choices. She drove the way you carry a sleeping child, with respect for weight and fragility. She passed a scooter abandoned at an angle that looked like prayer and a cow that had decided the middle of the road was as good a place as any to contemplate existence. When she reached the lowland causeway, the world lost color. Water on both sides. Water across the top. The current stitched patterns across the lane like something alive and restless. In the distance, the clinic's rooftop made a shape against the muted sky, a small defiance. Neria stopped. She listened, not to the engine but to herself. "I can do this," she thought. "I should not do this." The two truths looked at each other without blinking. She pressed her palms to the levers and felt her father's hands settle over hers as if time could do that. "Steady," she whispered. The carrier eased onto the causeway and the river greeted it with a shove. The tracks complained, then bit, then held. Water climbed to the midline and then to the sponsons, slapping with hands that wanted to pull. She breathed. She read the ripples like she read gauges. She advanced when the water softened, waited when it argued. The current tried to spin her. The weight said no. Halfway across, the radio crackled. "Hawa, are you out there?" Neria hesitated. Words cost attention. "Yes." "Good." "Hurry." "Define hurry," Neria said, and then the world tilted. A portion of the causeway let go like a tooth giving up. The water surged in with triumph, chewing at the edge under her left track. The carrier slid 6 inches into a new geometry. The steering lever fought like a living thing. "Come on," she told the machine, voice low and feral. "Come on." The right track grabbed. The left searched. She feathered throttle into the pocket where traction hides, just enough to bite without scouring all faith. The hull crawled forward with the humiliating courage of a toddler taking steps toward a ledge. The gap widened. The bow dipped. Water poured over the front lip and into the driver's well, cold as truth. She threw her weight and will into the right lever, throttled in a prayer arc, and the machine responded with a groan she felt in her molars. The left track found gravel. It bit. The hole rose an inch and then 3. She exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been denying herself for a lifetime. The far edge came up like an answer. The clinic's rooftop looked less like a postal stamp and more like a building. A figure waved a white sheet that became a bird in the wind. Neria allowed herself one small smile, a crack in a wall. She'd tell the engine a joke later. And then the siren came, not hers. A convoy rolling out of the gray. Olive paint that had not forgiven anything. Headlights that made promises the road couldn't keep. She knew those silhouettes like a mechanic knows bones. The army had come onto the causeway from the far side, their lead truck pushing a bow wave fit for a ship, assuming the world would make room. On the radio, a new voice thumped into the channel, heavy and certain. Unidentified tracked vehicle, stop immediately. Power down. This is a restricted corridor. Neria's mouth dried. She glanced at the stretcher bay where a mother clutched her baby and a man whispered a prayer he'd borrowed from his grandfather. The causeway was too narrow for pride and bureaucracy alike. There was no room to turn, no room to argue, no room for two kinds of purpose to prove themselves right. Unidentified tracked vehicle, the voice repeated, closer, impatient with other people's emergencies. If you proceed another meter, we will. The radio popped with static and rain. Neria lifted her hand to the throttle, and froze as the lead army truck's front wheels slid sideways, the whole vehicle yawing as the current took the path of least resistance and the road took the path of least insistence. Soldiers shouted. Metal groaned. The truck's right tire hung over a new slice in the causeway that hadn't been there a heartbeat ago. Her own hull shuddered as the water pushed harder, hungry for the gap between them. The baby cried. Somewhere far away, thunder applauded the worst idea of the night. Neria's pulse went bright and hot and unarguable. She had 1 second to decide whether to reverse into the river's mouth, to hold position and watch other people drown neat and legal, or to punch forward into a tangle of uniforms and authority that would own her for the rest of her life. She tightened her grip on the levers. Steady, she told herself. The tape told her nothing back. She took the breath she'd been saving for the moment that would change everything, and drove straight at the sliding army truck. She drove straight at the sliding army truck. The current pressed at the hull like angry hands, each eddy a whisper asking the machine to yield. Neria kept the bow shy of the crumbling edge and let weight argue with water. The carrier's track teeth kissed the causeway's broken lip and bit down. Metal moaned. The lead truck sagged another inch toward the void. She eased the left lever back and pushed the right forward, slewing the nose across the lane. The carrier's flank presented to the current, a wall instead of a spear, breaking the flow that had been gnawing at the truck's footing. Soldiers on the truck's running boards clutched the door frames and stared as if a myth had driven out of the rain with hazard lights. One of them shouted something she couldn't hear over the thunder and the blood in her own ears. Hold, she yelled to the engine, to the tracks, to herself. The hull shuddered, found a new angle, held. She popped the side hatch and scrambled onto the roof. Rain needled her face. A sergeant with a hard jaw and eyes like wet slate clambered across the truck's hood with a line in his hand. The line arced toward her, too short. Neria stretched, missed by a thumb's thickness, and lost her balance. She slammed her palm on a welded cleat and hung there with one foot skidding on algae-slick paint. Again, she shouted. He nodded once, coils feeding through gloved hands with the practiced economy of a man whose mistakes had always been expensive. This time the line dropped across her forearms. She hauled it in and looped it twice around the forward cleat she had added for the world exactly like this. Her father's voice lived in the part of her mind that measured forces, 2 wraps and a half hitch. Don't make it pretty. Make it hold. The truck's front axle groaned as the causeway sloughed away another scarf of asphalt. The sergeant's men piled out, weight suddenly treasonous. One slipped. Neria's stomach dropped with him. He splashed into the brown water and pinwheeled toward the gap, then hit the carrier's flank and found the outcropping of welded steps she'd bolted on yesterday. He clung there, coughing, eyes wide with a child's surprise at still being alive. She knelt, grabbed his harness, and hauled until he did the rest. In the driver's seat again, she took a breath measured in engine cycles and fed in power. The line went tight. The truck's nose shivered, considered dignity, and climbed 2 reluctant inches back toward geometry. Soldiers shoved on the fenders and shouted in voices that weather shredded into threads. The sergeant braced his boots against the bumper and pushed with the fury of a promise he had made to someone who would one day ask him why he had come home tired again. "Steady," Neria whispered. The tape above the periscope had soaked loose, its ink bleeding but still legible. She pressed into the pull, feathered back before drag could drag her, tugged again. The truck inched. The current sulked. The causeway held. A baby cried behind her. A mother sang 2 notes of nothing in particular to tell the child that the world had shape. Neria's chest went tight and then wider, as if something inside had decided to make more room. She gave the lever one last polite demand and the truck popped free of the bite that had been eating it. The sergeant stumbled, caught himself, and stared across the rain at her with a gratitude that seemed to embarrass him. He cupped his hands and shouted. She couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the shape of them. "Thank you. And also, don't go yet." The radio snapped to life with the same voice that had ordered her to stop. "Tracked vehicle, identify yourself." She thumbed the transmit and tried to make her voice taller. "Local workshop. Medical evacuation under flood relief. 2 civilians aboard. Request passage to clinic." Static chewed at the edges of her sentence. "Stand by," the voice replied, more practiced than patient. The sergeant swung up onto her hull with rain sluicing off his helmet. Up close he looked younger and older at once, as if command had folded lines into his face ahead of schedule. "You," he said, as if the word were curious. "Who are you?" "Neria Halim." He peered through the hatch into the dim interior. That's a lot of machine to drive with one name. It was all they would fit on the bill of sale. The corner of his mouth decided not to smile. "We've got another truck behind that one with med supplies for the upland camps. Roads vanishing by the minute. If you can break the current the way you just did." "I can shepherd," she said. "But the causeway's doing subtraction. We'll add shovels." He tapped his radio and spoke in a clipped code that sounded like chess and knife fights. Then he met her eyes again and, for the first time, did not look through her as if she were inconvenient physics. "Thank you." She nodded. "Stay off my levers." The second truck came forward with less confidence and worse luck. The water in the gap had learned their tricks and had new ones ready. Twice Neria eased her carrier sideways to become a breakwater, a patient shoulder for the battered truck to lean against. Once the current got cute and shoved her hull toward rebar teeth that waited below the surface. She let the weight work for her, let the tracks skate just enough to blunt momentum, then bit again and drifted back into line. Twice the sergeant's men found themselves in the water and twice Neria's hands found their harnesses at the right minute instead of the last. By the time they reached the far bank where the clinic's yard had become a lake, the storm had backed off to watch the results of its tantrum. The air smelled like wet iron and tree leaves arguing with gravity. The clinic's staff had lined the stairs with buckets, mops, and faces that wore 3 nights of not enough sleep. Hawa's bicycle leaned against a post as if it had pedaled through the flood on insult alone. Hawa herself stood at the top of the stairs with a walkie-talkie and a glare that could boil water. When she saw Neria climb out of the hatch, the glare turned into something that wanted to be a hug and settled for a clap on the shoulder. "You brought a wall," Hawa said, voice frayed but intact. "Good. We needed a wall." "And a door," Neria said, nodding toward the rear hatch, and the medics moved like rain-trained dancers to offload the mother and child. The sergeant took the steps 2 at a time to keep up with Hawa's decisions. "We have a generator, fuel, for fluids, 2 surgical kits, and a lot of willing backs. We have 3 rooms with mud for floors, a laboring mother, 6 dengue patients, and a ceiling that leaks in 12 places, Howard replied. Excellent. Let's waste no more words. Orders became movement. Lines of people passed boxes overhead like ants pretending to be a river. The sergeant's men turned their shoulders to the worst of the work without complaint. Neria wiped her hands, then wiped them again, as if the rain had left last night's mistakes on her palms. You, Hawa said, catching her. Don't run. Think. Tell me what this can be besides what it is. Neria looked at her machine and saw possibilities in it like rooms in a house she hadn't explored. An island, she said. A power source for the suction pump. A heated box if I pipe coolant through the side panel with a heat exchanger coil. A field X-ray if we can borrow one of the portable systems from Isla's clinic and mount it stable. If we rig a canopy frame, the roof is a triage deck. The stern could be a winch point for a ferry line if the bridge goes. Good, Hawa said, already halfway to her next decision. Start with power. Then ferry. Neria climbed back in, pulled up the floor plates she'd reinstalled with bolts slightly longer than necessary so she could find them with cold fingers later, and exposed the heart of a machine that had survived wars and neglect to write a new job description. She dug out the inverter she had salvaged and tested last week on a coffee grinder because it had been the only load handy at midnight and because she had needed the coffee. The inverter hummed. The suction pump gurgled like a child learning to trust a straw. She smiled despite the rain crawling down her back. The sergeant appeared at the hatch with a length of rope and a question he had decided to expose. You said ferry. We anchor across the yard to the high banyan, she said, pointing. You tie the free end to a canoe or the supply pallets. The current is a bully, we give it a rule to follow. You speak bully like a native, he observed. Machines and men, she said. Same grammar. He gave her a look that said he was filing the sentence for later. What's this thing called? It hasn't told me yet, she said, and forgot to be embarrassed by the honesty of it. They ran the rope. They built a ferry and then became it. Over the next hours, the carrier towed pallets of supplies into the clinic yard and dragged the mud into a shape people could walk through without resenting their shoes. It carried out the sickest, it carried in oxygen bottles like silver ghosts, it became a table for a field surgery when the delivery room ceiling decided it preferred to be a sieve. At dusk, when the rain retreated to argue with the horizon, Neria sat on the carrier's roof and watched the sky turn the color of good tea. Her hands ached in that useful way that means you have been a human being among other human beings and not just an opinion. The sergeant climbed up and sat without asking if she minded, which felt like permission she didn't have to grant. You drive like a person who remembers names, he said. What does that mean? You make space for the fact that metal forgets what it was made to do if no one asks it kindly, he said. My name is Azim. I thought it was Sergeant. Only to people who need titles to decide how to behave. He offered a small, almost shy smile. You have given my men a story they will tell wrong to their grandchildren. They can borrow the parts one got right. He looked out over the waterlogged town. Generators throbbed. Someone laughed like defiance. There's a column coming in from the east, he said without turning. Bigger than us. Commanders. Photographers. People who sign things. They will want to see your papers. I laminated them, she said, and he huffed something like a laugh. They will also want to own the story. He glanced at her. It will be easier if you let them. Easier for whom? For the next time you need fuel, he said. For the next time you need to argue with someone who thinks the rules are a virtue even when they're wrong. He rubbed a thumb over a scar on his knuckle as if reading its old text. For the next time some district officer needs a picture to hang on a wall. Neria thought about the carrier's engine note when it caught this morning, the way it had softened from protest into conversation. She thought about the baby's eyes, the mother's two-note song, her father's hands on hers the way memory lies convincingly. She thought about whose story it had been today and who had had time for stories while other people waited for air. Okay, she said. They can own the story. but the machine belongs to the flood. Fair, he said, and pushed himself to his feet. We'll need you at dawn. The upland road is trying to remember its life as a riverbed. Bring your wall. She slept on the stretcher bench that night, the carrier's steel warming slowly under the blanket of engine heat she had persuaded to circulate through her coil. The hull pinged as it cooled like a thinker considering a complication. Outside, frogs auditioned for parts in a chorus they had not rehearsed. When she dreamed of turning wheels, not of cars but of decisions. The convoy arrived near noon the next day, when the sun had decided to show its face as if to take credit for the drying. An armored SUV led, then 2 trucks heavy with crates, then a pair of vehicles that wore communications masts like antlers. The gates to the clinic yard opened as if to a possibility and also a problem. A major stepped out first, his boots ignoring the mud by pretending it was not there. He had the brisk cheer of someone who wins arguments by starting them before other people arrive. Hawa intercepted him with a clipboard and a glare that did not believe in rank but was willing to negotiate with it. The major smiled for the camera that hadn't even been raised yet. "This is excellent work," he said in a voice tuned for quotations. "The Army is proud to support community resilience." Hawa did not blink. Community resilience supported the Army last night. She jerked her chin toward the carrier. "She pulled your truck off the river." The major's smile hiccuped. He turned to look. Up close, the carrier's scars were a map of everything that had tried to stop it and failed. Mud had dried in the seams like a tattoo half-faded and still fierce. The welded cleats and brackets looked like words written in a handwriting you have to grow up around to parse. "Whose is this?" he asked. "Mine," Neria said from the hatch. He studied her, the way men sometimes study a misfiled document that nonetheless carries the correct stamp. "Your papers are in order?" She handed them over without comment and watched him perform the theater of inspection. He did it well enough to be convincing to the lens that had been raised behind him by a public affairs corporal with an eye for angles. When he reached the demilitarization certificate, he hesitated, took a breath, and decided to agree with it. "This is decommissioned," he said. "Not to be rearmed." "It has lungs, not teeth," she replied. "It inhales water at the bow and exhales it out the bilge. It speaks medicine through those sockets. It eats mud." A new voice interleaved theirs. "And it saved my men from being eaten by the river." Azim stepped forward, helmet off, face clean in the way that suggests a man is washed for honesty rather than presentation. "With your permission, sir, we will borrow this wall for the upland track and return it by dusk." "Borrow?" The major glanced between Azim and the carrier and back to the camera. "Loaned, then. In cooperation." He straightened like a man stamping language. "Who will drive?" "Who do you think?" Hawa said. The major hesitated 1 beat longer than optics like. Then he handed the folder back to Neria, nodded at the camera as if it had just whispered a compliment, and said, "Proceed." The upland road had been an ordinary inconvenience before the flood. Now it was a series of questions without punctuation. Fallen trees asked if they could become walls. Landslides argued with gravity and lost, then tried to win in all the wrong places. Where the road still existed, it wore a skin of silt slick as soap. Where it did not, rock waited underneath like bone. Neria let the carrier pick its way as if it could feel with its tracks. She kept her eyes on the periscope and on the world outside it at once, the way you watch a child running toward a street with a ball. The truck behind her followed in the track parallels she left, trusting her to have argued with physics on their behalf. At the second washout, the road simply refused. Water slid through the cut like an idea no one liked and everyone obeyed. On the far side, an old woman stood on a chunk of hillside with a plastic chair, her chicken under her arm like a handbag, her chin forward. "Everyone is on that side," Azim said, leaning from the second truck's window. "The clinic outpost. The schoolhouse shelter. We go around?" "There is no around," Neria said. "There is through." She studied the cut. The water was belly deep to the carrier if she misread it, thigh deep if she didn't. The far bank sloped ugly but gripped with enough gravel to promise friction to the faithful. She felt the angle in her spine before she acknowledged it in her brain. "Give me a rope," she said. "Tie it to the truck's front axle. If I slide, your weight becomes my conscience." "I prefer being your admirer," Azim muttered, but he tied the rope himself. She drove into the cut as if into an argument with a man who thinks volume is proof. The water shoved sideways with rude hands. She kept the nose slightly up, fed throttle like patience, trimmed it like grammar. The left track slid, then bit, then celebrated. The right refused to participate until she coaxed it with a notch more power and a grant of mercy. The nose climbed. The belly scraped. She swore at the air with a poem of her own, and the carrier, galled into pride, heaved itself out of the trough and onto the far bank with a grunt that felt like humor. Behind her, the truck eased into the cut and followed like a child walking on a parent's footprints in snow. The rope stayed slack. Azim drove with the hands of a man who had just been taught a new respect for a woman who refused to apologize to water. On the high ridge beyond, they found the schoolhouse. Half the roof was a tarpaulin. The other half was the sky. Children watched from a doorway that had learned to make room for more people than doorways are built to consider. A nurse whose name badge had lost its letters waved them into a courtyard that had become a plan. "We're short of everything," she said faintly, as if the statement had been repeated until it had worn a groove in her throat. "Except courage. That we have in insulting abundance." They set up a triage canopy using the carrier as one pole because nothing else was tall enough. The inverter hummed again. An oxygen bottle hissed softly with the promise of air the way words promise sense. A boy with a fever breathed easier. A woman in labor breathed slower. A man with a broken wrist held still while the nurse set the bone with a care that made apology unnecessary. A roomer arrived in a pickup. The lower dam's sluice was jammed with a mat of bamboo and plastic in fear. If it failed, the river would rewrite the map. If it held, the town would ring out and keep its shape. Someone had to clear it. Someone with weight, water tolerance, and stubbornness. Azim looked at Neria. Neria looked at the carrier. The carrier looked at the river. The river pretended not to be interested and failed. "Show me," she said. The dam was an old concrete face with new uncertainties. Water poured through the remaining gates with the concentration of a crowd going through a door when the band starts a favorite song. The jam choked the middle gate like a lumpy scarf. Men with poles had been prodding at it from the catwalk and accomplishing only drama. "If we open it with all that pressure," one of the operators said, "it will spit out a knife and call it a blessing. Or it will refuse to spit anything and call it your fault," another replied, then looked at Neria as if she might be the kind of lunatic that makes miracles in insurance adjusters. Neria ran her hand over the carrier's nose as if greeting a stubborn horse. "We rig a line from the catwalk, run it through a snatch block on the hull, tie into the mat. We don't pull it out. We worry it loose. We are patient. We let the water do the greed while we teach it where to go." Azim listened like a man counting other people's breaths. "If the mat surges," he said, "we lose the line and not the hull." "That's the hope," she said. "Hope is not a plan. The plan is to keep tension smarter than force." They rigged it. The snatch block screamed at the first load like a singer hitting a favorite note. The mat shifted, sulked, shifted again. The water licked its lips. A branch popped free and went through the gate like punctuation. Men on the catwalk cheered too soon and then pretended they had meant to be quiet. Neria fed the carrier backward a half meter, then forward 2 inches, then held while the water remembered how to persuade itself to change its mind. "Steady," she told the tape that no longer existed above the periscope and now somehow existed inside her, printed on the soft underside of her ribs. The mat surrendered without flair. It relaxed as if embarrassed for having made a scene. The middle gate cleared. Water pulsed through with relief, then settled into a new song. Downriver, the level lowered enough to turn some islands back into peninsulas. Azim let out a breath he had loaned to the job and then forgotten to reclaim. He slapped the carrier's flank with his palm. "You are a mule," he told it with affection. "And also a saint." The operator ran a hand through hair that had not been dry all day and said to Neria, "Where did you learn to make heavy things polite?" "By being one," she said, and the men laughed a little too hard because they needed to. The next week blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. The carrier hauled generators up roads that did not believe in roads anymore. It ferried a teacher who refused to leave her chalkboard in the rain. It anchored a bridge made of 2 doors, a ladder, and an insult. It slept beside her on nights when the stone returned to threaten their progress with old arguments and new voices. She wrote notes on masking tape and stuck them everywhere. Check bilge before sleep. Grease idlers. Fuel is hope, count it. She learned the names of children who climbed the hole and banged on it like a drum. She learned the names of soldiers who stopped using rank when they needed truth. She learned the road's new grammar and taught it to the track levers with each breath. Stories began to collect around them like burrs on a sock. The major's press officer sent up a video that made Neria look 5 inches taller and 30% less anxious. A news channel ran grainy phone footage of the rescue at the causeway with music that misunderstood heroism. The district officer arrived for his photograph and stood as far from the mud as he could while still being in the frame. Hawa endured it with the posture of a woman reciting a curse as a blessing to protect the people within hearing. One afternoon, when the water had retreated enough for old arguments to reassert themselves, a black SUV rolled into the yard with tinted windows and the kind of quiet that announces expensive decisions. A colonel stepped out, then another, as if the car were a pocket that kept finding money. They wore the expression of men who are not used to hearing no. Behind them came a woman in civilian clothes with a notebook in a stillness that made Neria think of journalists who have learned to hear between the words. "You are Neria Halim," the first colonel said, and it was not a question. "I am," she said, "because names are not rank and rank is not the same as truth." "You acquired this vehicle legally," he continued, "for which we commend you." He did not look like a man who enjoyed commending, but he did it anyway. "You have employed it in service of the public good, which we recognize. There are, however, concerns regarding control and safety." The second colonel took over as if handing off a baton. "We are proposing a formal partnership. The vehicle will be seconded to the District Emergency Corps for the duration of the monsoon season, with Army oversight. You will remain its operator of record." He had the kind of competence that makes people relax until they notice the price tag. "What does oversight mean?" Neria asked. "In sentences without acronyms." "It means," the journalist said softly, stepping forward before the colonels could clothe the idea in more uniform, "that they want to borrow your credibility and your wrench." The colonels did not flinch. "It means," the first one said, not looking at the journalist, "that we will ensure fuel, spares, support, and protection from the sort of paperwork that eats projects alive." "And in return?" Neria asked. "In return," the second said, dry mouth smoothing the word, "you agree to let us be the ones who get in trouble when things go wrong and the ones who answer the phone when donors ask where to wire money." He allowed himself the tiniest smile. "And you let us pretend we invented you." Hawa made a noise that was not a word and also contained 3 paragraphs of editorial. The journalist wrote without looking down. Azim stood a little to the side and watched Neria's face the way you watch a gauge you do not entirely trust to tell the truth in time. Neria thought about bolts and promises, about the way a rope spreads force so that no one not has to carry it all. She thought about the night the causeway gave way and about the day the gate surrendered to the patient pole. She thought about being owned and about belonging. "Fuel and spares," she said. "And you do not paint over the welds." The colonels blinked, synchronized. "Why would we do that?" "Because someone will want to make it look like it rolled new out of your factory," she said. "Leave the scars. They are the paragraphs of this machine's biography. They tell people how to trust it." The first colonel considered her, then nodded. "Leave the scars," he repeated to the journalist's notebook, and sounded surprised to find that he meant it. They shook hands on the partnership. Paper followed, because paper always follows and sometimes leads. The carrier acquired a reflective stripe on its flank and a call sign that made sense to radios. It did not acquire a new soul. Neria would not have let it. With support came expectations. A request arrived from the Army's engineering branch, politely framed as curiosity and absolutely infected with scrutiny. Would she bring the carrier to the central workshop 2 districts over for an inspection? They would evaluate her modifications for safety. They were eager to learn from field-driven innovations. The quotation marks bent the sentence into shape. Azim read the message and rubbed his jaw. They will lift your hood, he said. And they will try to hire your hands. They can borrow my notes, she replied. My hands belong to Karbad until the water stops asking for them. Even so, he said, this might be useful. For later fights. For fuel. For the next flood's favor. She agreed and bargained for time enough to finish the ferry line across the canal and to deliver one last load of antibiotics upstream. Then she drove the carrier along a road that had remembered it was a road, Azim's jeep ghosting along behind like a shadow that did not intend to be ominous. The central workshop was a cathedral for metal, high windows, cranes that could lift theories into practice, floors that had been introduced to scrub brushes on a schedule. Men and women in coveralls moved with the choreography of a place where mistakes are not tolerated but precisely logged. An engineer with a badge that said Zahir in block letters greeted them with a hospitality that did not disguise his excitement. We've never had one of these roll in under its own guild before, he said, running a hand along the carrier's flank. Usually they arrive on trucks, ashamed. She was never ashamed, Neria said. Just tired. Zahir heard the pronoun and nodded as if that explained more than grammar. We'll measure everything you changed, he said, and we will try very hard not to change the things you taught it. They put the carrier on a lift meant for heavier ambitions. They opened panels, weighed brackets, tapped welds, and asked questions that were prayers disguised as engineering. How did you decide this thickness? Why this angle? Where did you steal this idea? Neria showed them the coil that turned engine heat into a kind of kindness. She showed them the bilge pump's redundancy, the way the suction line had been routed high and then lower with a valve that let choice be a button instead of a hope. She showed them the stretcher rails that collapsed into benches and the canvas racks that could swallow up personal dignity and spit out dry socks. Zahir pointed to a section at the rear where the armor plate had been cut and replaced with a hinged hatch she had fabricated with a friend's brake press. This is not regulation, he said mildly. It is a door for a person on a board who cannot fight a narrow space, she said. Regulations were written by people who planned to be standing up. He looked at her for a heartbeat longer than most people like to be looked at, then nodded slowly. Leave the scars, he murmured, and she smiled despite herself. In a side bay, a group of officers clustered around a table with tea glasses and the aura of men waiting for a show. They gestured her over and asked questions that wanted to be answers. Could this platform be duplicated? Could it be modular? Could it be deployed with a kit and a manual and a young mechanic with a spine of duty instead of a spine of stubbornness? Could the kit fit into a pallet that fit onto a truck that fit into a doctrine? It can be made teachable, she said. But you cannot send the kit without the permission to improvise. Floods are rude. They do not respect checklists. One officer whose epaulets glinted like a statement frowned. Improvisation breaks safety. Dogma breaks necks, she replied before Azim could kick her ankle under the table. Give them principles to hold when the plan fails. Weight. Flow. Redundancy. Steady. Zahir leaned forward, curiosity overruling caution. Steady? A word that saves lives, she said simply. Write it where they can't help looking. They argued until the tea went cool. They argued into an agreement to build a small run kit, heat coil, bilge redundancy, stretcher rails, inverter mount, roof canopy frame, cleats, snatch block, ferry line anchor, a bag of bolts and the authority to ignore half of them for the right reasons. Zahir promised to send 2 apprentices to learn from her in Karbad. The officer with statements for shoulders promised fuel for the season and an introduction to a donor who preferred functional stories to glossy ones. The journalist in the corner wrote without looking up, and Neria tried not to think about which sentences would become hers only in someone else's voice. On the way out, Zahir stopped her with a question that had waited its turn. Why you? He asked. Why this? She thought of her father's hands. Of the child strapped to a motorcycle last monsoon. Of the ribbon cutting that had never arrived at a bridge still drawn on paper. Of the message that had sneered, "Careful they don't come take it back." Of Hawa's glare and Azim's softening and the way the carrier's engine note had become part of her breathing. Because it was heavy, she said. And because it was wrong to leave it rusting when it could carry people. Because someone had to go first so that next time the question is smaller. Zahir's look changed the way metal changes when you heat it and then let it cool in a new shape. We will build the kit, he said. And we will leave the scars. On the drive home, the sky performed a talent show of blues. The river uncurled its fists and pretended it had never held anything tight. At the causeway, Cruz patched the bite that had eaten the road the night she had chosen to go forward instead of backward. The patch looked like a bandage on a boxer who was already planning his next round. People on bicycles waved. Someone shouted her name, and it landed on her shoulders like a scarf that fit. Back in Karbad, the yard smelled like rain diluted by sun. Rafiq stood with a wrench in one hand and a grin he tried to conceal behind a scowl. Your tank's on the news, he said. It looks taller on television. Everything does, she said. Even me. He nodded at the hole. You going to name it now? Neria looked at the machine that had let her be a little braver than she had promised herself. The carrier looked back with the humility of steel. Names are heavy, her father used to say. They make promises. Ghazal, she said finally. Rafiq blinked. A poem? A poem that repeats, she said. That returns to a refrain, not because it cannot leave but because it chooses to remind. He let the grin win. Ghazal it is. They painted the name in small letters near the hatch where only people close enough to be careful could read it. Children traced the letters with scrupulous fingers. Hawa looked at the name and nodded once, like a judge stamping a certificate. The months folded and unfolded. The floods receded, the work did not. The kit arrived in crates stamped with Zahir's shop mark. They assembled 2 more conversions, civilian trucks grotesquely lifted and armored in the places that mattered, not to make them look like soldiers but to make them behave like friends. A pair of apprentices learned how to measure with their knuckles and listen with their palms. The district officer stopped asking for pictures and started sending fuel. The colonels visited less and sent more. Sometimes the carrier slept. Sometimes it did not. Once, in the deep blue hour before dawn, Miri awoke on the stretcher bench with the knowledge that something had been decided elsewhere and was arriving at her door like weather. She put on boots. She made tea. She opened the yard gate. The army came. A convoy, but not for floods. A flatbed, but not for delivery. Reporters, but not with the posture of opportunists. A general, which is a word that covers a lot of specific men, stepped out and looked at the whole the way people look at graves and monuments, both the same shape from a certain distance. He did not smile. We have a problem, he said, and it was not an introduction. 2 valleys over, a munitions convoy went sideways on a mountain road. Landslide took the switchback. Trucks teetering. If they go into houses. We cannot reach them with our usual reach. Hawa appeared at Neria's shoulder as if conjured by the scent of importance. Azim emerged from behind the carrier as if he had been there all night pretending not to guard it. Rafiq wiped his hands on a rag that was no longer a rag. The apprentices tried to look like they had done this before. The general looked at Neria. Will your poem climb a mountain? If the rhyme suits, she said. But poems do not like explosives. We will secure the loads, the general said. We need your wall to hold back gravity long enough for us to move fate. And behind his words was the heavier thing he did not say, we need your nerve more than your machine. We need your stubbornness. We need the way you make other people reconsider their relationship with the idea of impossible. They drove at once. The road to the mountain chewed on tires like a habit it was trying to quit. The switchbacks were razor stanzas, the drop-offs were punctuation marks no one wanted to earn. When they rounded the last bend, the scene snapped into the shape of an equation with too many variables. 2 trucks perched on the lip of a fresh scar where the road had been, a third pinned sideways by a slide of rock no one had asked to arrive. Below, a cluster of houses huddled like families at a graveside. "First we stop the slide," Neria said, more to herself than anyone. "Then we become a new road." They drove stakes and strung lines. They anchored a snatch block to a pine that had opinions about this and was overruled. They ran the carrier's hull up to kiss the leading truck's bumper and let it put its weight on her the way a man in grief leans against a friend who does not talk. They inched. They worried. They held breath. The first truck accepted the suggestion of sanity and backed onto a flatter section with the humility of a sinner in a fable. The second had less shame. Its rear wheels had lodged in a groove cut by the sluice of rock. The load, ammo crates, shivered with every movement like a choir trying to find the same note. Azim's men patted the contact points with blankets. The general did not breathe in a way that other people could see. Neria set her palm on the lever and felt her father's hand on hers, and beyond it, the machine's pulse in sync with hers. "Steady," she said, and this time 3 other people said it with her without noticing, and the word became a room they all stood inside. They won the second truck by being the kind of patient that is loud inside and quiet outside. The third required a kind of audacity that Neria had not worn since the night on the causeway. They had to make a road where there wasn't one by using the carrier's flank as a sliding wall and the hillside stubbornness as a tool instead of an enemy. Rocks protested. Chains sang. Men moved in a math that made the general's eyes water with respect he did not put into a sentence. When it was done, the houses below were still houses, not statistics. The trucks were trucks again, not metaphors. The general shook Neria's hand with a grip that carried the weight of his epaulets and something not embroidered on fabric. "What do you want?" he asked, and it was not a trick. "Fuel," she said. "Pumps for the clinic. Money for bridges that are not speeches. Apprenticeships for girls who prefer torque to TikTok. A map that shows the low places as places where help lives, not where trouble starts." He laughed, short and startled and honest. "You ask like a person who has finally realized she has leverage. I ask like a person who has learned that leverage is the only thing that moves the heavy." He nodded. "Done," he said, and for once, in a language usually reserved for promise breaking, the words sounded like the future instead of the past. They drove home under a sky doing its impression of forgiveness. At the edge of Karbad, people had already heard because news in a town like this travels along the same wires that carry gossip and prayer. Children ran alongside the carrier, hands patting the flank as if it were a friendly elephant. Someone had strung a banner across the workshop entrance with paint that dripped honesty, "Thank you, Neria and Ghazal." The lowercase z in the name made her heart turn over. She did not correct it. Mistakes are part of the true record. Inside the yard, Hawa climbed onto the hole and turned to face the crowd that had gathered in the street without anyone organizing them. She lifted a hand and the talk fell into listening. "You already know what she did," Hawa said, jerking her head toward Neria. "And what the poem did." Laughter broke like a wave and then settled. "You also know the water will come again, next year or the year after, and it will not care about our speeches. So we will be ready. We will build 3 more, and when the river knocks, we will answer with boots and welds and ropes and songs. If you want your name on a bracket, bring your hands in the morning." The cheer that rose was not for victory but for enrollment. Neria took off her cap and let the hot evening breathe on her scalp. Rafiq leaned on the hole with his scowl that was now just a habit he did not know how to quit. Azim stood near the gate with an expression Neria had seen on men when they watch a sunrise they did not expect to survive to see. "Tomorrow," Hawa shouted, "we start with tea." That night, Neria lay on the stretcher bench and did not sleep. The shop ticked. The city hummed. The poem of metal and mercy beside her seemed to breathe. She thought of the first day, of the rust scales cutting her palms, of the absurdity of buying a thing that could eat her savings and spit out stillness. She thought of the current shoving and the tape that said steady and the baby's 2-note lullaby. She thought of the colonels and the general and Zahir's apprentices, of the dam's sigh and the mountain's surrender. She thought of names and of the weight of having won when other people finally learned to say it without flinching. In the blue hour before the birds rehearse, she went out into the yard and touched the hole. "You did well," she said to the steel. "We did well." The hole kept its counsel, as always. Steel does not preen. It keeps score and scratches and dents, the way a person keeps score and lines around the eyes. Her phone buzzed on the bench behind her. A message from an unknown number. "Unknown, I was wrong. Sorry. If you need extra hands, I have two." She stared at the screen until the letters softened. Then she wrote back, "Bring donuts." Morning came with pickaxes and laughter. The apprentices argued about whether to mount the new inverter on rubber isolators or spring hangers. Rafik pretended not to love them with a worried father's intensity. Hauer ran a ledger that was less about money than about promises. Azim arrived with a box of bolts and a rumor that the army wanted to order 10 kits and call them something bureaucratic. "Let them," she said, tightening a bracket. "The poem will still be called Ghazal." He nodded, watching her hands with the attention of a man who knows what hands can make and unmake. "You know they will put you on a stage," he said. "You will have to wear a clean shirt. You will have to say sentences that sound like mottos." "I can do that," she said. "I can say steady into a microphone." "And after?" "After, I will go back to where bolts live," she said. "After, I will grease the idlers and count the fuel and teach the apprentice who keeps pinching his fingers that you don't need to prove pain to show you care." He tilted his head. "Do you know what you did?" "Drove a heavy thing into a river," she said. "Then into a mountain." He shook his head. "You made the army surprised at itself." She laughed, and the sound surprised her. "Good. Surprise is where learning lives." He set the box of bolts on the bench and looked at her with a seriousness that made humor step aside. "Also," he said, "you made me proud." She did not know what to do with that sentence, so she did nothing. Sometimes doing nothing is the most respectful thing you can do with a gift. In the afternoon, the general returned with a ribbon and a microphone and a speech that, to his credit, had learned a little from the week. He did not talk about glory. He talked about torque. He said steady without wincing. He handed her a plaque that would make dust look distinguished and, more importantly, a binder that contained approvals and fuel chits and a letter that made donors want to sign their names in generous ink. The journalist threaded through the crowd afterward and stood at the edge of Neria's shadow until invited in. "May I write your ending?" she asked. "There isn't one," Neria said. "There's only the next flood." "Then may I write your middle?" "You may write my middle," Neria said. "But leave the parts where I was afraid. People need to know that heroes are just people who did not wait for the fear to finish making its point." The journalist smiled like a person who has been handed a rope that fits her hands. "One last question. Why do machines listen to you?" "They don't," she said. "I listen to them." In the evening, Neria climbed onto Ghazal's roof and watched the town become a map of porch lights and quiet ambitions. The banner had been taken down, the paint was still on the concrete where small feet had scuffed it into confetti. She closed her eyes and rehearsed the feel of the levers, the pressure and the sway, the way the hull had lifted on the causeway, the way the rope had sung at the dam, the way the snatch block had screamed and then sighed. She opened her eyes and saw, in the street below, a girl tracing the letters of the name near the hatch, lips moving as if reading a prayer. The girl looked up, caught Neria watching, and lifted a thumb that contained more sincerity than any certificate. "Tomorrow," Neria told the roof. "We start early." A breeze carried the smell of wet mud and fried onions. The sky made a promise it would not keep, because skies never do. The poem at her feet glowed faintly where the welds caught the last light. The world was heavy. The world was movable. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Weeks later, when the river had settled into obedience and the army's kit had sprouted on the backs of 2 other carriers now named by other hands, Neria received an invitation written in an ink that pretended to be modest and failed. The Capitol. A symposium. Innovation in civil-military disaster response. A stage with chairs that expected people to sit as if they had not hauled rope all week. Hawa circled the date on the calendar with a pen that made noises of reluctance. "Go," she said. "Come back with Diesel." She went. The auditorium was full of men who had fashionable beards and women who had invented ways to get work done without asking permission. Slides glowed. Acronyms attempted to seduce. Panels happened in groups of 3 and 5 and 7, because odd numbers give the impression of openness. When it was her turn, she stood between a logistics expert with a graph and a colonel with a moral, and she told the truth, that you cannot pave over doubt with doctrine, that improvisation is a muscle, that kit without culture is a coffin, that nothing she had done would have mattered if the baby's mother had not sung 2 notes in faith. She used no slides. She brought the snatch block and held it up. The audience broke into a laugh that had relief in it. She said steady, and the room tried the word on and found that it fit. Afterward, in the green room, a man with a suit that looked like money's good mood said, "We have factories. We want to help. Build bridges," she said. "And teach welders. And your design," he pressed. "We could scale." "Scale if you must," she said. "But don't smooth it until it doesn't catch on real problems. Leave the scars." He frowned as if that was not how factories like to flirt. "Scars are bad for branding. They're perfect for trust," she said, and shook someone else's hand. When she came home, Karbad was boiling water for tea as if the world had always done that and not panic. The yard had grown a new pile of parts and a new chalkboard with drawings that Zahir's apprentices had begun without waiting for permission. Azim was there, pretending to need a bolt he could have found in his own supply room, and Hawa was there, pretending not to be pleased by the number of people who had shown up on a day when nobody had told them to. "Speech?" Rafiq asked, leaning out of the office window. "Short," she said. "Good." They set to work. The next flood did not schedule itself according to their convenience, but they had learned that convenience is a luxury for dry seasons. They built, they taught, they sang. And on the nights when the sky darkened its brow and the river lifted its chin, Neria sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the levers and felt the poem breathe. She had named a machine and built a kit, but the thing that mattered was the way people had begun to move when water knocked, toward each other instead of away. As summer sagged and the first rumors of another storm shuffled in from the coast, a letter arrived that had none of the army's careful edges. It was from the woman whose baby had cried in the causeway. The handwriting stepped gingerly, like a person walking on a floor that might still be wet. "You don't know me," it said, "except you do. My daughter's name is Lila. She learned to sleep to the sound of rain again last week. When she is old enough to ask what her name means, I will tell her it means game but also night. I will tell her that the night we thought would be a game for the river, a woman drove a heavy thing into the water and made the dark behave." Neria read it 3 times, then taped it inside the hatch where only she and the poem could see it. When she closed the hatch, the letter was safe in the dark, close to the engine's heart. That night, alone in the yard except for the drone of insects having complicated personal lives, she sat on the hull and listened to the town breathe. The moon gave the steel a pale sheen, and the welds drew lines across it like sentences scored into a book's margins by a thoughtful reader. A shadow moved near the gate. A figure stepped into the light, the district officer, without his SUV, without his photographer, without the armor of his voice. "I came to say thank you," he said, and the words seemed to cost him a fee he had not budgeted for. "And to ask if you would, if we might, commission 2 more for the upstream blocks." He held out a folder that did not look like it had learned how to lie yet. Inside were signatures that belonged to budgets, to approvals, to things that start, finally, to move. Neria took the folder. She looked at him for a long second and then made it easy. "Bring your hands," she said. He nodded. "I will bring donuts." She smiled. "Now you're learning governance." The wind lifted the banner's remnant from where it had snagged on the fence. Somewhere far off, thunder rehearsed lines. The poem at her feet waited without impatience. Tomorrow, there would be bolts to count and a ferry to test and a new apprentice to teach how to listen for the moment when an engine decides it wants to live. Tomorrow, something heavy would ask to be moved, and she would move it not because she was fearless, but because she had learned to proceed while fear made its case in the other room. She climbed down. She locked the gate. She wrote 3 words on the chalkboard for the morning. Leave the scars. Steady. Begin. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.